Alright, now that we have put stay stitch on our armholes, necklines, our waistlines, we have our darts in here, as well as the sleeve, plus the edge stitching. And then we've gone through and we've checked all of our seams to make sure everything is exactly 1/2 inch. We're ready now to put the two bodice pieces together, and then we'll do the sleeve. Take out your ruler and your pencil, and let's come down here to our bodice side seams. Right here along the side seams at the armhole, what we're going to do is we're going to take a ruler and a pencil, and here I'm measuring on the front, and I'm going to put a little cross mark, and this is where we have 1/2 inch seam allowance from the side seam crossing over this stay stitching at the armhole. And let's do the same thing here on the back. So again, this is the 1/2 inch seam allowance of the side seam. We're putting a little cross mark here at the armhole. Now let's come over to the shoulder seams here on the front and back. Now I want you to do the same thing, but we're going to put this cross mark on both sides. So it's going to be here at the neck and here at the armhole. Now remember, when we sew these together, we want to have the raw edges coming to the outside, just like we have the dart legs coming to the outside. And let's start here with the shoulders. So take your front and back and put them so they're wrong sides together. Come up here to the shoulder area. So here, when we're lining up the raw edge of the shoulder from the front to the back, you're going to notice that the shoulder seam allowance here goes longer at the neck than the back because they're two different curves. But here where we have the stitch line, which is the 1/2 inch, and we have the 1/2 inch seam allowance here from the back as well as here on the front, these will still stack perfectly right on top of each other. So go ahead and do this now, where you're putting the pin through the stitch line as well as the seam allowance from the front, and then the same thing here on the back, so you know they're right on top of each other. And then get the rest of the raw edge lined up going towards the armhole, and of course there's a notch here at the dart. And then you can pin this in place here at the neckline and come on out here to the shoulder, and we'll pin this in place as well. Now out here at the shoulder, I should be able to go right through the stitch line and that seam allowance guideline we did in pencil, and you have the same thing here on the back side. Once that's in place, let's go ahead and pin this so it doesn't move. So now when we put this under the sewing machine, we're going to sew starting from the armhole going towards the neckline. Let's turn this over so we have the back is up on top, and we'll come over here to our side seam. Again, at this side seam we put the pencil mark right going across the blue stay stitch. You should be able to put a pin right through that, and then you should be able to put the same pin through the back right where that pencil is. So at the seam and the pencil, so you know that these are stacked together perfectly. Go ahead and get the rest of the raw edges lined up, and once you have the notches lined up as well as down here at the waistline, let's go ahead and lock this in place. And we'll come down here and we'll pin this at the waistline as well. And this pin, I have it where it's pointing back up towards the armhole, because we're going to come under the sewing machine. We're going to start at the armhole and sew going towards that pin, and you can just hold it as the machine pulls it through. So now we have the shoulders pinned from this side, and we have the side seam pinned from this side. Let's go over to the sewing machine and sew this up. Now here on the sewing machine, I've switched my threads now back to where it's just blue on the top and blue on the bottom. We're going to go ahead and sew the side seam first. Right now I have the back pattern pieces facing up, and the armhole and the side seam is what I'm going to start sewing with. So I want to line this up at exactly 1/2 inch. And we can start sewing here without doing a back tack. Once I get to the armhole where there's a pin holding it, I'll go ahead and pull that out. I'll make sure my notches are lined up, my raw edges are lined up, and then we'll sew the rest of the distance. As I get to the bottom, I can just hold on to this pin at the waist and let the machine pull the fabric through. Now down here at the bottom, we want to do a back tack so this doesn't fall apart when you're doing a fitting with your client. Now I did not do a back tack at the top because if my tension was off a little bit, right now I could relax my threads going back up into the armhole. Since everything is good, what we're going to do is we're going to take these threads and go ahead and tie them into 3 knots. And then later on when you sew your sleeve in here, we're going to do a back tack as we come across the seam so the side seam won't accidentally fall apart when you're doing a fitting with your model. Now let's turn our pieces over to where we have the front is facing up, and we're going to start here at the armhole of the shoulder. Now for this one, I don't want it to fall apart up here at the shoulder when we're doing a fitting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew down to the pin, which is right along with the seam. I'm going to take that pin out, and then I'll do a back tack just right here in this area. So right along where we see this seam, I'm going to just do a little back tack right here. And now I can sew the rest of the distance going towards the neck. Make sure as you pass the dart from the shoulder on the back that the dart is pointing towards you, which is also pointing towards center front and center back. As I get to the pin here at the neckline, what I can do is hold the pin, and it's still holding all those pieces in place as I sew this right off the machine. When you get to the stitches, again, we don't want this to fall apart when we're doing a fitting, so go ahead and do a back tack just right on top of the stitches, and then you can sew off the fabric. Now, because we did a back tack right here on the seam and right here on the seam, if your tension was too tight, you would not be able to loosen this out. So make sure your tension is perfect before you come in and do this final stitch. Now that I have all these stitches overlapping each other, I can go ahead and start trimming my threads down to just a 1/2 inch. And the same thing here at the side seam. I'm going to fold this along the darts, and we'll take this back over to the tabletop. Alright, so taking out your sleeve here, what we're going to sew is the 2 underarm seams together. Again, we want the underarm seams to be to the outside so you can make adjustments when you do a fitting. So what we're going to do is we're going to fold this in half with the wrong sides together. And let's look at it here. So this is the front side of the sleeve, and then underneath is going to be the back elbow dart. So come up here to the top where you can pin this, making sure that the raw edges are lined up perfectly at the armhole and the underarm seam. Now here at the elbow dart, what you want to do is we want to have the two raw edges smooth and the fabric is flat all the way to the elbow dart. And let's pin this at the elbow dart, but when you pin it, just pin a little tiny bit. Now the reason you want to pin just a little tiny bit is because this layer underneath has to pivot. So if you remember, because we have an elbow dart, we have this underseam is going one direction here and then a different direction there. So in order to line up the raw edge with the back and the front, we have to be able to pivot some of the thickness of the fabric up here to get these to align down here. And what we're going to do is we're going to do that when we're on the sewing machine and we get to that point. Now if you remember, we did some shaping here in the seam allowance at the wrist. Remember we folded the wrist under, we cut it out and unfolded it, and it had a little shaping to there. So we need to make sure we're following that when we're sewing on the sewing machine. Take out your pencil and your ruler and come down here to the wrist area. What I'm going to do is, here on the front layer, I want to follow the 1/2 inch seam allowance that's going in this angle, and then there's a 1/2 inch seam allowance that's following this angle. And then turn this over. We'll do the same thing with the back piece. So again, down here at the wrist, make sure you're following the raw edge. This is the seam allowance into the wrist area. And this is the seam allowance heading towards the elbow dart. So there's a little bit of an angle here, and that's intended. It's supposed to be that way. For later on, when we roll this under, all the seam allowance will relax underneath. Alright, let's take this over to the sewing machine. Now for this sleeve, again, we don't want this to fall apart when we're doing a fitting, so we're going to do a small back tack here at the top. So go ahead and pull your threads to the back, hold them down, make sure this is exactly lined up at 1/2 inch. Sew for a couple stitches, and we'll do a back tack. Now we could pull this pin out and keep going to the elbow dart. So leaving the needle down, I can pull the foot up, I can pull this pin out. So if you look down here at your wrist, you'll see that the front layer is drifting off this way and the back layer is coming around. So we need to get those to switch back. What you don't want to do is don't pull on any corners or on the bias, because you're going to take this off of the block. But you can use your fingernails to get the fabric on the top layer to travel in this direction. Now remember here at the wrist where we have our pencil line where it makes a transition, and the same thing on the bottom, and it's right at those stitches. Well, what we want to do is we want to put a pin right through that transition point here, and it should be going through the exact same location at the back. If it's not, just keep moving the fabric in between your fingers until you get those 2 points to line up. So right here at the top and down here at the bottom. And then what I'll do is I'll lock this in place, making the pin pointing up towards the sewing machine. Now we can continue sewing all the way down to the wrist level, but I want you to make sure that you stop at the wrist. Once you get to the wrist right at the seam line, go ahead and let's pivot this over. So I'm making sure that my back seam allowance is lined up correctly, and then I'll make sure my front seam allowance is lined up, and we can continue sewing. Stop without doing any back tacks. Let's take this off the machine. Now, because we did a back tack up here at the top, if your tension was off and there's a little bit of some rippling inside of here, what you can do is you can get the threads to go all the way down towards the wrist to get the tension to relax back out of here. If everything looks good, we can go ahead and trim these threads down to 1/2 inch here at the wrist and the dart. And then your thread up here in the armhole. And if you relaxed your threads, everything's good to go, then we can trim our threads down to 1/2 inch here at the wrist. Alright, let's take this over to the tabletop. Okay, so back here on the tabletop, what we want to do is we want to start finger pressing these seams open. So it's going to be butterfly open. Come over here to your bodice and the side seam here, and we'll finger press this all the way down to the waistline. As you're finger pressing, you should get all the way down to where you can see every little blue thread inside of there. Let's do the same thing here at the shoulder. Again, we're making sure that you're finger pressing it down to every single last stitch going along that shoulder. Now for the sleeve, we want to finger press this open, but at this point in time, your sleeve is a tube. So what we need to do is we want to have the center of the sleeve and this underarm seam, we want to have them right on top of each other. So then we can come in here and finger press this. Now as you get down here to the second half, remember that there's 2 different angles, so you need to move the fabric a little bit differently to get in here and get this nice and flat. So here you can see when I'm finger pressing, I'm getting this right down to the blue threads. Now down here at the wrist, what we're going to do is we're going to turn the wrist over so you can see exactly where the sleeve ends. Now because the wrist is 2 different angles on both sides of this, we have to come in here and clip the seam allowance. So just below your blue stitching, go ahead and clip inside the seam allowance area. Now what we can do is we can turn the sleeve to the inside of the shirt. In this way it'll look a little bit nicer and clean finish for your client. And also you can get a sense of exactly where that wrist level is hitting at. So turn it to the inside and then gently finger press this. And basically you're using that blue stitch as a guide for exactly where to fold it. Once you have it in place, you can come down here to the tabletop and then get it a little more firm. And then out here we'll make sure that the seam allowance is butterflied open, and we'll just finger press that one more time. Now if you've done this correctly, the wrist should stand up off the tabletop because everything is nice and crisp and pressed cleanly. Later on when your client does a fitting and she puts her arm in here, her hand will hit some of this and kind of flop it out, and that's okay. Once it's on her, then you can go ahead and tuck it back under. The reason for having that 1-inch seam allowance is because wherever it's hitting down here on her wrist, if you want to add to it or take away, you can always just roll this in your fingers and re-finger press it and then mark it for the new wrist level. Let's come up here and let's start talking about what to do with this gathering stitch. On the outside of the stitch, we have the lighter color. So for instance, mine is orange, and the inside bobbin was the blue. What I want to do is I want to have these orange threads also here on the inside of the sleeve. So you'll notice if you pull on the blue threads, the orange threads from above will loop here to underneath on the inside of the sleeve. So you can come in with a pin and put it through one of the loops, and you can pull that orange thread here to the inside of the sleeve. So now you can see we have all 4 threads here on the bobbin side. The next thing I want to do is I want to make the blue threads short. So let's go ahead and we're going to cut these down to 2 inches. But the orange threads, we want to leave them long. Let's do that again here to the other side of the sleeve. And then I can pull the orange threads here to the bottom. Now the blue threads I want to clip, and I'm going to cut them down to about 2 inches length. So now you can see here we have the orange threads are on the inside of the sleeve. The next thing we want to do is we want to start to gather this in and shrink the sleeve down so it'll start cupping. How we can do this is you want to hold both of the orange threads, and you're going to start to pull those threads while you hold the fabric. And the thread's going to slide through between your fingers, and it's going to start gathering up the fabric from above. Then we want to take this area that we just gathered, and we want to smooth this back up towards the cap of the sleeve. And the whole time I have to hold these orange threads, or else they will start to just go back into the sleeve itself. So I'm going to pull a little bit on the orange threads. I'm making a small gather. I'm holding the threads, and I'm moving this gather back up towards the cap. Now up in the cap area, wherever you see 2 layers are starting to overlap each other, and this is what we would call a pucker. You want to ease without having any puckers. Now obviously, the harder I pull, the more puckers I will have. So if you're finding you have a lot, what you need to do is hold the threads up here and move the fabric and start to ease this, going back towards where you started. Now from one side you can only do so much, and then you have to stop. And then what we'll do is we'll come down here to the other side of the sleeve. So for instance, this is the back of my sleeve, and I can start gathering this one as well. So I'm going to hold just the orange threads. I'm going to pull on them while I hold the fabric, and I'm getting the threads to slide between my fingers. Now I have some gathers. I'll hold these orange threads while I move this gather up towards the cap of the sleeve. Now once I get up to the top here, I can see I have several puckers where it's overlapping, so I can hold it at the cap of the sleeve and start to move the fabric back to where it came from to get this to relax out. But I'm still keeping some of that ease here in the sleeve. So now you'll notice it's starting to curl up. It's starting to cup inwards, and this is exactly what we want. Now something else that's going on is the 1/2 inch stitch is going to ease at a different rate than the 1/4 inch stitch. This is just like 2 people running around a track. Whoever's on the outside has to travel further distance. So to get this to cup even more, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop pulling on both of the threads, and I only want to pull on the one that is that 1/4 inch stitch. So I'll come in here and I'm grabbing the thread that's the top one, the 1/4 inch, and I'm going to hold only that thread while I come in here and I'll gather that one a little bit more than the 1/2 inch thread. So here I did a little bit too much at first, and then I can relax it back out. And then I'll do the same thing here on the other side of the sleeve. Now when we're looking at all of the puckering going on here in the sleeve, the most important thing is this 1/2 inch seam should not have any puckers at all. But the 1/4 inch seam can have puckers, and that's no problem. So once I pull up some of the gathering here into the cap, what I want to do is I want to relax it along the 1/2 inch seam, but I don't want to mess it up on that 1/4 inch. So here most of my focus is just moving right along that 1/2 inch seam. So again, I'm just relaxing it back out so there won't be any puckers in the sleeve. And then you can always come back and pull some more from the 1/4 inch stitch to keep that cupping shape. Now the next thing I want to do is, if I start handling this and moving it around, all of this ease that I've gathered will just relax back out. So I want to lock it in place, but I don't want it to be permanent. What you can do here is take out a pin, and right here where the orange top stitch threads are coming through the fabric, let's go ahead and put a pin right there. And then I can take these orange threads and I can loop them around this pin like a figure 8. And then I'll put the pin into the sleeve one more time, and that's going to hold this thread in place so it won't come out. But of course this is temporary. Anytime you need to adjust your sleeve ease, you could pull this pin out and then you can take more or give away. Let's do the same thing here on the other side. So here's my orange threads coming out through the fabric. I could put a pin in the fabric right next to them. I'll loop around this pin like a figure 8, and then I'll put it through the fabric one more time to hold it in place. Alright, so get your iron on hot plus lots of steam, plus an ironing board. If you have a ham for ironing, go ahead and get that out as well. And then if you have a sleeve board, or if you have a ham that's designed for sleeves. Now over here on your ironing board, we'll want to iron our side seam as well as shoulder. Something you could do is you can come out to the tip of your iron and put your garment down to get that area nice and flat. Come in and steam this. If your ironing board is just a big giant rectangle, you can always do it inverted. So you would have the shoulder down like this. You would hold the bodice up in the air and press that. Same thing with the side seam. Or if you do have a ham, then you can come over to the edge and drape this over the edge to get that area. So for me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the ham because I also want to use this to get my darts, and I'll show you how. So I want to make sure this is all nice and flat, and I'm only going to press the area that I can get flat. So steam it and then let it cool off. And since I'm using the ham, I can rotate this to get the shaping for the dart. Let's come over here and we'll get the side seam. Now the side seam is a longer distance, so you can choose to press half of it here and then move the fabric and press the other half here. Or for me, if I came over here to the tabletop, I would just hold this inverted on the tabletop and I can get this whole area flat, including the darts. So I'm going to go ahead and come over here and get this dart from the front. And I'll get this dart from the back. Now if you have your ham and you wanted to, you can get the shaping for the dart by having the fabric hanging down off the ham, and the tip of the dart would be where it's starting to roll away from you. But when you're doing it like this, you can only press just where the dart is. Don't try to come over to center front, or else you're going to make a crease right here. And don't go too far along the waist, or else you'll make a crease down here also. But what we're able to do here is we're able to get smooth all the way around that tip of the dart area. Now when I do the front, I'll switch it around to where the dart is coming towards me. I'm looking for a wider part on the ham because this is a larger dart. So now I'm able to get that shaping for the bust. At this point now, the bodice itself is becoming this three-dimensional object, and it's a lot more difficult to set this down on the tabletop. What we can do is, for the back dart, you can press it so it goes inverted, and then you can fold this over the top so the front dart is still staying puffed outwards. And then you can set it back down onto a tabletop. Let's take a look here at the sleeve. Now if you're working on a flat surface like this and you want to press this the underarm seam flat, what you have to be really careful of is you do not want to crease this quarter folds out here on the sleeve itself. So really all you could do is come in with just the tip area of the iron and press this flat. But I'm making sure I never press all the way down and put a crease on the sides. And while it's cooling off, I'll go ahead and flop it, because sometimes even cooling off will make a crease, and I don't want it to crease at all. Now if you have a sleeve ham, what you can do is you could put the ham inside of the sleeve, and then you're able to press and steam the underarm seam. And this way you're still keeping your sleeve round. And you can let it cool off in that round shape. Now while I still have the ham inside the sleeve, what I can do is I can use the iron to go ahead and press this wrist level a little more crisp. and I want to let this cool off before I handle it. If you're looking to buy a sleeve ham, and there's several different sizes to choose from, obviously you're going to want the longest one that you can get, but you're going to want a smaller one. Even if I'm doing a large sleeve, it's still nice to have a smaller ham. And the main reason is you want this to go as far as it can go all the way here to the wrist. So even this ham itself is a little bit big for getting all the way to the wrist on this size 4 sleeve. Now the last thing is this is called a sleeve board. And here you can see, so this is longer and more narrow here at the end. For using the sleeve board, you can see it's kind of like the shape of a sleeve, and this would be the cap. So what you would do is, there's no bar except all the way back here at the very end. So you can start with the cap of the sleeve here and slide it along the sleeve board up into that area. Then you can come in here and you can get the full under seam nice and flat all the way to the wrist area. Just be sure on the sleeve board you're not steaming and pressing going around the corner, because then you're going to get creases on both of the edges. I want to come in and start steaming the cap of the sleeve. So I'm going to use this larger side of the sleeve board. Again, starting from the cap, I can slip this all the way through up here. And now where we've done all of this gathering and cupping, we can come in here and start to steam it and tell it to hold that shape. So for doing this, again, make sure your make sure your iron is on the highest setting, you have lots of water in there, and you can come in here and start steaming this to hold the shape. And I'm able to get 1/2 of the sleeve here, and then I'll rotate this. We can steam the top part, and I'll rotate it some more, and we can get this other side of the cap. So now as I pull it off, even more it's holding that shape for the cap of the sleeve. Now if you don't have the sleeve board itself, but you have a narrow enough on the front of your ironing board, you can bring it in and start to cup onto the ironing board and come in here and steam that. And you can rotate it around as you go. And if you've done a really good job of steaming this, letting it cool off, making sure that it's holding its shape, you want all these grains to stay in their place. And then you should be able to come over to a tabletop and your sleeve will freestand all by itself. Go ahead and take a photo of this as part of the assignment for completing this video. And then for handling the sleeve, what I would do is I would just allow it to relax with the center of the sleeve and the underarm seam together. And then you can see the dart from the elbow is just curling over a little bit right there. So this is how I would handle my sleeve from now on.